Thanks for being here. Again, I'm Bill Purcell, the Associate Director for Catholic Social Tradition at the Center for Social Concerns, as well as the Co-Director of the minor in Catholic Social Tradition, and it's my honor to act kind of as MC and moderator for this very distinguished panel today on Gaudium et Spes. And the wonderful thing about it is, Gaudium et Spes, each person will highlight essentially an exemplar connected. So how do we make it real? How do we make it incarnational? And how do we see that it's lived? So again, we have Scott Appleby, Alexia Kelley, and Bishop Ricardo Ramìrez. So what I will do is introduce each of our speakers and then let them give their presentation. Then at the end, we'll open up. Again, we'll have the microphones on each side, and as we do upstairs for questions for folks. First, we'll have Scott Appleby, who is the Marilyn Keough Dean of Notre Dame's School of Global Affairs. This is like the first new school at Notre Dame in about 95 years. So Scott has his hands full of nothing else. Scott is actually a professor of history, here at Notre Dame, and is a scholar of global religion, and has been at Notre Dame as a faculty member since 1994. Scott is actually an alum of Notre Dame in '78, and then he went on to the University of Chicago for his graduate studies and his Ph.D. Just so you know, Scott was then he was the director of the Cruces Center of American Catholicism when he first came here, then became the director of the Reagan director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies from 2000 to 2014. And as well as being the new dean for the School of Global Affairs, Scott also then directs the Contending Modernities. So he fits a little bit of the talk last night with Miroslav, which is a major multi-year project to examine the interaction between Catholic, Muslim, and secular forces in the modern world. And again, Scott is an expert actually in 3 areas. So when the Pope died, Pope John Paul II, he was an expert. So he's an expert in Catholicism. He's an expert on religion and culture, especially with violence around the world. But not only, again, about being a historian and then Catholicism and also peace, but he also has put up with me as my brother-in-law. So he's an expert in family relations. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Appleby to speak on, and he's going to speak on Pope Francis and the legacy of Gaudium et Spes. Scott?
Thanks, Bill. When Bill said a minute ago, I have my hands full, I just can't resist a grandfather story very quickly. I was out visiting my grandchildren in Boston, and the 3-year-old who absorbs everything like a sponge listens to his parents instruct him on various matters. And so I was helping move some things around the house, and Roland was sitting on the bed doing absolutely nothing. I said, "Roland, why don't you get up and help me?" He said, "Grandpa, I've got my hands full." Because that's what his parents tell him all the time. He didn't have his hands full, but he thought that would be a good excuse to do no work. So he had his hands full too. I'm grateful to the Center for Social Concerns and to all the sponsors and to all of you, and of course to Bill, who never ever annoys me except in one respect, in that he plans these things 5 years in advance. I do things the night before, and it's a shame to me. I'm always shamed by Bill's dedication, zeal, and ability to get things done way too early. I say, please stop embarrassing the rest of us. So my thesis, so to speak, of my presentation, the timing now starts now, is Gaudium et Spes, Pope Francis, and the State of Engagement, a progress report from the Academy. So that's the summary of the talk. Gaudium et Spes, Pope Francis, and the State of Engagement, a progress report from the Academy. The great clarion call of Gaudium et Spes may be summarized in a single word: engagement. The Pastoral Constitution, in no uncertain terms, condemns, quote, a split between the faith which many profess in their daily lives, and their daily lives. This strain of dualism which causes some Catholics, quote, to shirk their earthly responsibilities, and which, quote, deserves to be counted among the most serious errors of our age. The Old Testament counted this attitude a scandal, and even more so, quote, did Jesus Christ himself in the New Testament threaten it with grave punishments, that is, threaten the separation of church from the world. And in case you somehow missed the point of the pastoral constitution, quote, the Christian who neglects his temporal duties jeopardizes his eternal salvation. Rather, she should gather, quote, her humane, domestic, professional, social, and technical enterprises into one vital synthesis under whose supreme direction all things are harmonized into God's glory. It's paragraph 43. Throughout, Gaudium et Spes enjoins Catholics to engage with non-Catholics, with non-Christians, with the modern world generally, and the sciences more specifically, with the secular world in all its dizzying variety, or at least with whatever dimensions of secularity that we discern to be committed to pursuing justice and the common good. Literally dozens of passages of Gaudium et Spes emphasize this imperative. Let me select the one that bears on the concrete case I'll be discussing, namely international collaboration for the development of peoples. Paragraph 84. In certain situations which can obtain anywhere, this commitment to the world means the general need to promote the growth of developing peoples, to attend to the hardship of refugees scattered throughout the world, or to assist migrants and their families. The international agencies, both the universal and regional, which already exist, assuredly deserve well from the human race. These stand for the first attempts to lay international foundations under the whole human community for the solving of the critical problems of our age, the promotion of global progress, and the prevention of any kind of war. The Church rejoices at the spirit of true fraternity flourishing between Christians and non-Christians in all these areas. This spirit strives to see that ever more intense efforts are made for relief of the world's enormous miseries, close quote. So, how are we doing on this score 50 years on? How are we doing in engaging beyond the church, beyond Christianity, with the entire world? How are we doing in building alliances with those who share our thirst for justice and the common good? Well, in a nutshell, I would say whereas Vatican II's framing, the two framing constitutions on the church in the modern world command Catholics to exit the enclave, sally forth from the fortress, and eschew the sectarian in order to reclaim the universal mission of the church as a light to the nations and to enhance and to embrace the temporal joys and hopes, grief, and anxieties of the world. Despite that clear charge, this command has been imperfectly obeyed over the intervening half-century, with moments in these past 50 years of genuine and deep engagement interspersed with too frequent retreats into enclavish patterns of self-isolation or into ideological alliances across ecclesial and secular lines, which in their combative and exclusivist orientation make a mockery of the intent of the council. So the point here is that we have seen some wonderful episodes historically of genuine engagement for the sake of peace by risking hospitality with the other to move forward for the healing of the world, as it were. But we also, especially more recently in that 50-year period, I think, have retreated into a kind of collaboration with the other, but the other has been perhaps the religious other, the non-Catholic, but who shares a certain ideological commitment, and that commitment sometimes takes over against or a combativeness that was not in the spirit of the council. So we have a lot to do about reflecting on the nature of our engagement as church with the world. The pontificate of Pope Francis already counts as one of the grace-filled moments of engagement in the spirit of the council. But it remains to be seen whether the Pope can lead the church beyond an epiphenomenal and partial engagement with the world into a serious and sustained collaboration between faithful Catholics as Catholics on the one hand, and on the other, individuals, institutions, and agencies that do not share some of the fundamental bedrock assumptions and beliefs of Catholics, but who do share our sense of responsibility for the poor, the environment, the sick, and the ignorant. Numerous are the fraught issues we could discuss under this rubric, including attitudes toward potential partial partners in the work of the common good. Under what conditions, then, have we taken the risk of hospitality and welcomed unlikely partners as allies and collaborated with them where we find common ground, without being denounced as, quote, cooperating with evil or otherwise compromising Christian conviction? There have been times when certain kinds of engagement have been criticized because they're not totally pure in the sense of engaging only with those who agree with us on every issue across the spectrum, rather than on the particular problem or misery we're trying to address. Which is it? Lord, those who are not against us are with us, or those who are not with us all the way are against us? Yes, and what are the related knotty problems of cooperating fully with the social sciences, the private sector, civil society, and governments, however deeply flawed those agencies and institutions and sectors are? How are we doing on collaborating with such agencies to reverse what Pope Francis calls the globalization of indifference? These are difficult questions, and I'd love to take them up, but I'm limited by time. Therefore, due to these limitations, I'm going to focus on what may seem to some a trivial example of this larger challenge of engagement, but it's a challenge I know something about, not least because we are in the process of trying to build a school at Notre Dame, a Catholic school of global affairs that is called to engage beyond the church, beyond the academy, with the private sector, with governments, with non-governmental organizations. And we're already in the early days of trying to structure this collaboration, coming up against some of these very serious questions. With whom do we engage? With whom do we collaborate? Under what terms? It's not a question that's going to go away or that has an easy solution or resolution. So I'm concerned here with the Catholic university's engagement with, indeed reliance upon, highly specialized academic disciplines, methods, and professional practices of the academy, of government, of corporations, and so on, that might at times reflect and advance a narrowly technical and empirical view of the human person and of human society. How do we engage with those agencies, institutions, forces that seem to reduce the human person and society to the narrowly technical, the empirical? And not because these agencies or institutions recognize that they're somehow reducing human dignity. They are attempting to solve problems we all face and to do so in the best, most efficient possible way. Nonetheless, there's a different orientation to the human person if there's a thoughtful orientation from a Catholic perspective at all. How do we engage with the physical, the biological, the social sciences, responsively, creatively, and humanely? This is the challenge Gaudium et Spes posed to the Church 50 years ago. It's still with us. It remains a pressing question. It's a question I suspect we have not yet answered adequately, certainly not finally. It is highly relevant not only to economics, study of business, study of politics, but also to the study and practice of development, peace, and even human rights, to the extent that reasons, evidence, and metrics for these disciplines must be made to fit within the reductive context of data. While valuable, even wondrous, and I mean it, what's really striking and impressive is the growing consensus across these sectors when we're faced with the problems of climate change, of hunger, of poverty, of ongoing violence. There is a growing consensus in certain sectors on devising solutions that are empirically sound, data-driven, scalable, that is, being able to be moved quickly to scale, so you're not just providing bed nets for a community in East Africa. You're providing bed nets for the entire region very quickly, for example. How can those kind of solutions nonetheless give rise to problem solving and solutions which unintentionally, with unintended consequences, seem to ignore the human person and her comprehensive dignity, which is rather difficult to quantify? There was a great conference at the Keough Institute held in Rome in the fall I was really struck by, I was pleased to attend, on human dignity and human development. And a variety of experts from around the world, inside and outside the church, say, well, how do we devise development programs, mediation, cooperation with partners in the field who are working to overcome poverty, and do so in a way that really captures human dignity? What is required of you? People disagreed, of course, about whether human dignity is inherent in the human person, very fundamental issue like that, or whether we somehow give people their dignity. The Catholics in the room said not the latter. People already have their, but the state of the question is, dignity, what is that exactly, and what does that have to do with poverty and development and so forth, and it's too abstract and so on. So how do we engage in a conversation like that, which has real-world, very practical consequences for how we fight poverty, for example? Gaudium and Spes suggests that the church's role is to balance the hard data of the sciences with the harder mystery of human transcendence, and in a striking passage, issues a word of warning to the modern technician. Quote, number 8, within the individual person, there too often develops an imbalance between an intellect, which is modern in practical matters, and a theoretical system of thought, which can neither master the sum total of its ideas, nor arrange them adequately into a synthesis. Likewise, an imbalance arises between a concern for practicality and efficiency and the demands of moral conscience. Also, very often between the conditions of collective existence and the requisites of personal thought and even of contemplation. Here's a striking sentence. Specialization in any human activity can at length deprive a person of a comprehensive view of reality. There's a little zinger for the Academy. Close quote. Pope Francis, more than his immediate predecessors perhaps, echoes and updates Gaudium and Spes' call for engagement with the world, and especially with the professional problem-solving sectors that know how to conduct randomized controlled trials and scale up, but have less use for interest in or insight into some of the subtleties of human freedom, culture, religion, and spirit. My colleagues and I visited Boston last week, it was, to learn about these terrific schools of global affairs, global development at Harvard, MIT, Tufts, and elsewhere. And we had a wonderful, many of our interlocutors, deans and faculty and professors at these outstanding universities really welcomed Notre Dame's presence in this area, partly because they recognize the importance of meaning, purpose, value being central in the discussion in a way that maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago there wasn't that recognition that we need to come to some conversation about ethics of development, for example. The most entertaining meeting, I should say very quickly, was with a leading economist who actually invented randomized controlled trials. Joined us for lunch right out of central casting. Hadn't shaved in a while, didn't know which way he was going, was wearing Keds, ruffled, rumbled, and in a bad mood. He was terrific as an economist. He's, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He was in a bad mood, so he said, okay, I hear what you want to do. You want to do all the things we're doing as economists and development experts, and you want to talk about human dignity and justice. Please don't use those words, he said. And we just don't know what to do with them. They're soft. Come on, we've got the numbers. We said, well, don't you, but we're talking to you because you deal with practitioners in the real world who are facing these concrete issues. And he said, yeah, but it's so painful. It's so painful to deal with the people who are actually practicing in the world. Now, this was very entertaining because he articulated what we had suspected some of the attitudes to be in a very friendly way. He was a very likable person and quite brilliant. Typically, Pope Francis begins with a statistic or a finding from the social sciences or the hard sciences. Thus, he commented recently in response to the report of the Global Slavery Index, estimating there are nearly 30 million people worldwide living in slave-like conditions, quote, "We are facing a global phenomenon which exceeds the competence of any one community or country. In order to eliminate it, we need a mobilization comparable in size to that of the phenomenon itself," close quote. Note the emphasis of the Pope on mobilization, as he mentions elsewhere, of all sectors, church and the religious, corporations, governments, non-governmental organizations. Today's, quote, "culture of enslavement and the globalization of indifference must be countered with a fresh recognition that everyone belongs to one human family and, quote, a new worldwide solidarity and fraternity capable of giving victims new hope and helping them to advance with courage is called for," the Pope says. Cooperation between governments, organizations, and, quote, "the world of finance," to use his term, is needed to fight organized crime. On this occasion, he was speaking of organized crime, which orchestrates human trafficking and the illegal trafficking of migrants, the Pope said. Businesses, quote, "must ensure dignified working conditions and adequate salaries for their employees, but they must also be vigilant in ways that forms of subjugation or human trafficking do not find their way into the distribution chain." What is the Church's role in this mobilization of governments, the private sector, and civil society? I'll conclude, because I know how long Bill's arms are and they can reach down here. I'll conclude with 5 very brief suggestions of how the Church might engage more robustly, concretely, with governments, the private sector, and civil society. I'm going to just, because of time, throw these out there, and hopefully we can pick them up and explore them if you're interested in doing so in the discussion period. Number 1, prophetic, the prophetic role of the Church. We know we haven't departed from the priority of prophecy in that sense. And what's really striking and encouraging, I think, is that the people in this emerging, I'll call it the emerging secular world, recognize that the words secular and religious these days are freighted with internal complexity. So forgive me for using this clunky word, the secular. But we have folks who are engaged with the United Nations, with governments, who are not explicitly religious, but who nonetheless look to the Pope as a prophetic figure that whose prestige and dignity and influence they are delighted to partner with. I'll give you just one example of each of these. We had the economist Jeffrey Sachs here, who's very important in formulating the original UN Millennial Development Goals and is right in the middle of the Sustainable Development Goals that will be announced hopefully later this year. And Sachs, in various speeches, both when he was here on campus but beyond, he has slides of the Pope. His theme is the globalization of indifference, which is the Pope's theme. And he quotes, as he quoted in one lecture, this quote from the Pope: "The condition which put people at risk of exploitation must be addressed, such as poverty, lack of access to education and employment, armed conflicts, terrorism, and corruption, by a range of actors, law enforcement and government officials, and people, and what has to be addressed is what happens when people are, quote, willing to do anything for financial gain, and when money and not the human person is at the center of the economic system." These are the kind of quotes that folks like Jeff Sachs are taking from the Pope and framing their own approaches with, even though most of them that I'm referring to are not Catholic and won't share everything under the sun about the Catholic worldview and set of convictions. So the prophetic, the speaking out against globalization of indifference and other aspects that weaken the body politic and the common good, is very much in the mainstream, and Pope Francis is identified with it. Second, the priestly. The priestly in the sense here of giving a blessing to, shepherding, endorsing, those things in the world which are sincere attempts to address the major challenges. I met with a very important expert in conflict mediation and sustainable development named Larry Susskind at MIT, who was just giddy about the Pope addressing the General Assembly and the encyclical on the environment. He said we couldn't have gotten a better gift that this Pope is going to be giving a blessing to, in a way, and challenging the world to take adaptation to climate change seriously and prioritize it as a matter of faith, of conscience, and of effort across sectors. Number 3, revelation or full disclosure. So the church is prophetic, it's priestly, it's revelatory. And I say revelatory or full disclosure, by which I mean disclosure of fullness. We had, I think he wouldn't mind mentioning that we're in a conversation with Raj Shah. Raj is not Catholic. He's the outgoing director of USAID, and he's interested in working with Notre Dame precisely because one of our themes is to lift up these value questions, questions of meaning, of purpose, and he also, when I say giddy, I was just moved by how excited he was that that the Catholic institutions, not just Notre Dame, want to bring to the table of development conversations the explicit discussion of meaning and purpose. What do we think we're doing? And he says, in none of the government agencies he's worked with, in none of these sectors, do people speak openly about their motivations, about ethics, about values, about meaning. Not only are these important to lift up, but they lead to much more productive and effective and fulsome service. I'll mention the final 2 very quickly. Dialogue, collaboration, and partnership. And I think this is well known to all of us here, the ways in which the church engages always, all the time, and has since before Vatican II, especially in the post-conciliar period. There were organizations like CRS, Catholic Charities. Cardinal Turkson held a conference last year on impact investing at the Vatican, that how do we work with the private sector and the church to dedicate resources from corporations to lifting people out of poverty. That dialogue is taking on a new depth and meaning as we move forward together in engagement. And finally, correction. How the church still must, this is slightly different than prophecy. This is to ask, what is being left out of the conversation? The conversation about dignity, peace building, the conversation about development, human rights, peace building, and so on. What's being left out when human dignity is left out? Why does it make a difference? How do we infuse the technical, scientific, problem-solving world with the joy and the hope of the gospel? I look forward to our discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Scott. And again, we'll have a discussion after each speaker goes. So the next person is Alexia Kelley, who will speak on the joy and hope of philanthropy. Alexia is the president and CEO of FADICA, which is the foundations and donors interested in Catholic activities. She has degrees both from Haverford and from Harvard. We were co-workers together at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, where Bishop Ramìrez was our chair. We both worked together at the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, where Alexia was for 10 years. She also worked for the Environmental Resources Trust and co-founded with Jen back McWard in the back, the Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, and also served in the White House Office for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. So we're going to move things over to, and she's going to also speak on Catherine Drexel as well as philanthropy. Thanks, Alexia.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks so much to Notre Dame and its stellar Center for Social Concerns for the invitation, and to Father Paul and Bill for having me here today to talk about Gaudium and Spes and philanthropy. It's impossible not to recognize how deeply the document has affected both the life of the church and how it continues to frame that spirit of generosity at the heart of philanthropy in a distinctly Catholic way, of course. I want to just reference a few passages in the document that are especially relevant to the dynamics of Catholic giving. In that foundational opening that has been quoted many times over the course of these days, the council authors speak of the church's desire to share in the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of our time, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. And here is the genesis of two key themes that shape Catholic philanthropy in profound ways. First, we pay attention to the signs of the times, to the trends and events affecting the people of our own day. And second, we pay special attention to the poor and those who are afflicted. Or as Pope Francis says, we go to the peripheries, to the marginalized. Catholic giving seeks to address the material needs of our brothers and sisters, and we take Matthew 25 to heart. We are all called to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and give drink to the thirsty, but it doesn't stop there. We go to the poor not just to help them, we go to them so that we can encounter Christ. And this option for the poor sets Christian giving apart. Here we come to another insight of Gaudium and Spes that makes Catholic philanthropy distinctive. The document states that beneath all these demands lies a deeper and more widespread longing of persons and societies, a thirst for a full and a free life, one that is worthy of humanity. When meeting with philanthropists, and particularly with the members of FADICA, time and again I see this desire for genuine encounter and for all to have that fullness of life worthy of the children of God. Gaudium and Spes also clearly demands that we understand our neighbor in universal and global terms. Our church is Catholic with a lowercase c, and our neighbor can be the person who knocks at the rectory seeking a sandwich or the family devastated by a typhoon in the Philippines. And Catholic philanthropy abroad is not confined to disaster relief. We are also called to go deeper to the causes of poverty and injustice, as Catholic Relief Services does with such integrity, and as Catholic Charities USA does here at home as well. More significantly, as Gaudium and Spes makes clear, baptism unites all Christians and calls us to recognize all persons as our brothers and sisters. This has very practical consequences as it gives Catholic philanthropy, especially abroad, a kind of insurance from becoming a new form of colonialism, imposing our own definition of others' best interests. And we have the opportunity, especially abroad, to work in solidarity with and through the local church, where Catholics on the ground can tell us what is needed. We see how Pope Francis, in his earlier ministry, and now as Pope, insists on this, that our church is not just for the poor, but also with the poor. Now I'd like to talk for just a minute about St. Catherine Drexel, who, as an inspiration and in many ways a godmother of Catholic philanthropy in this country, brought these themes and the spirit of Gaudium and Spes to life. And she did so before the document was even written. Born to a very wealthy family in Philadelphia, with a strong tradition of philanthropy and service to the poor, Catherine was drawn to the struggles of Native Americans and African Americans. They became her primary philanthropic concern, and she dedicated her life and fortune to help them achieve fullness of life. These communities were the most ignored and frankly quite despised at the time, nor were they the priority of philanthropy, including Catholic charitable efforts. As further inspiration, Mother Catherine exercised her philanthropy at some personal risk. For example, when she began the work to build Xavier University in New Orleans, which is the first and still only Catholic university serving primarily African American students, she had to work through third parties to acquire the needed land, since opposition to educating and supporting African Americans was so strong. In addition to Xavier, St. Catherine built a network of Catholic institutions in service to Native and African Americans, making the church present to them. She founded the Blessed Sacrament Sisters, which at her death included 500 sisters serving at 63 schools and 40 missions in 13 states. She died 10 years before Gaudium and Spes was written, yet she lived its vision. She discerned the signs of the times in the light of the gospel, and that light led her to the most marginalized of her time. Canonizing her in the year 2000, Pope John Paul II said, "To those whom her own society neglected, she extended a preferential love." Who are the neglected or the marginalized of our day, in our world and in our church? And to whom are we called to extend a preferential love? These questions are at the heart of Catholic giving, and over the last 2 years, our members at FADICA, we have about 45 Catholic foundations and philanthropies who are members of FADICA, they engaged in a strategic planning process to reflect on this question and others. As part of that, they also formed new member working groups to read and in some cases act together in response to the signs of the times in areas of common concern. One of the most vibrant groups focuses on Catholic education. FADICA members have been instrumental in supporting new financial and governance models to sustain Catholic schools, particularly those serving low-income children. Catholic philanthropists are active in school systems from Los Angeles to Camden in partnership with their dioceses and often hand in hand with leaders of ACE here at Notre Dame. Inspired by St. Catherine's legacy, several members of FADICA just recently launched the Drexel Fund, a new venture philanthropy designed to scale up high-quality and financially sustainable networks of faith-based and other private schools. Another of the working groups engages around church vitality and has focused recently on supporting the capacity and development of Catholic sisters across the globe and lifting up the vocations and ministries of sisters in the U.S. For example, through National Catholic Sisters Week earlier this month, the brainchild of the Hilton Foundation. Members are interested in leadership development to support a vital church from expanding vocations to lay ministry, and the group is thrilled to be working with Dr. Kathleen Sprouse-Cummings here at Notre Dame to illuminate recent key research findings regarding Catholic sisters. A third working group focuses on international philanthropy. For decades, many FADICA members have supported the church throughout the world in its diverse ministries promoting integral human development. In the 1990s, one of the organization's proudest moments was partnering with the U.S. bishops to help initiate the collection for the church in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, members support Catholic ministries that deliver education, health care, clean water, and orphan care throughout the developing world, with some concentration in Africa and India. Together, the group has looked at child survival strategies and more recently on the need for strengthening Catholic health systems made so clear by the recent Ebola crisis. And here at home, Catholic Foundations work with local Catholic charities agencies and other ministries to serve and empower those on the margins, those in poverty or unaccompanied minors and refugees at our border. Foundations are also pioneering cross-sector solutions. One interesting example is that sponsored by the Better Way Foundation, which recently supported a research initiative at Catholic University encompassing 24 dioceses in partnership with Catholic Charities USA and others, which explored linking Catholic Charities services for at-risk kids with Catholic schools in order to advance early childhood development. We were also honored to have representatives from Notre Dame's Lab for Economic Opportunity address our members last year about their important work to develop impact evaluation models for critical Catholic Charities programs. In recent years, another urgent and far-reaching need has come to the forefront as our members looked and listened to the signs of the times: human trafficking or truly modern slavery, as Scott mentioned. Pope Francis is deeply committed to this issue. His first Mass this year focused on modern slavery on the Church's World Day of Peace entitled "No Longer Slaves, but Our Brothers and Sisters." The signs of this time, in this case, are mostly grim. Nearly 30 million people are living in some form of modern slavery through forced labor or the sex trade. It is a growth industry with profits tripling over the past decade to an estimated $150 billion this year. And in some countries, slavery is deeply entrenched and has been integrated into the social and economic life for years. For example, Mauritania has the highest prevalence of slavery, with 4% of the population in some form of bonded labor in either the agricultural or domestic sector, and that slavery is passed on from generation to generation. Modern-day slavery is structurally endemic, and its evil effects are not limited to poorer countries. It's certainly alive and well in our country. These signs of the times call to our conscience as the plight of African and Native Americans awaken the conscience of St. Catherine Drexel. And many are responding on campuses like Notre Dame and in partnership with survivors, a very important approach. Several FADICA members were proud to support a convening last year of young survivors and leaders, all under the age of 25, against sex trafficking at the Vatican's Academy for Social Sciences. These young leaders presented their recommendations to end trafficking as part of an interfaith anti-slavery initiative called the Global Freedom Network, which was launched at the Vatican. The U.S. Bishop's Migration and Refugee Services has been at the forefront of advocacy, victim assistance, and prevention. Their multifaceted work includes the Amistad movement, which is empowering vulnerable immigrant communities through peer education in trafficking prevention. And more than 15 years ago, the U.S. Bishop's Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which, as Bill mentioned, Bishop Ramìrez chaired so wonderfully when Bill and I worked there, CCHD presented its very first Cardinal Bernardine New Leadership Award to 22-year-old Lucas Benitez, a young farm worker and leader with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Lucas helped organize and advocate for exploited agricultural workers, including those in labor slavery in Florida. He was the first person I ever heard use the word slavery in a modern context, almost 20 years ago. Through the Coalition's hard work over many years and the meticulous auditing of the working environment, supply chain, and growers, they and their partners have eradicated slavery conditions in the tomato industry in Florida. This recent and incredibly historic achievement, supported by the generosity of Catholics in the pews, shows how we can all participate in ensuring a full and free life for our sisters and brothers. Several members of FADICA's anti-trafficking affinity group have supported the work of Catholic Sisters to aid victims and empower survivors, such as the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Trafficking and an international network called Talitha Kum. Catholic Sisters have been leaders in the grassroots solidarity and care for victims and have catalyzed advocacy efforts for improved laws and enforcement. Now in closing, I'd like to turn to reading a key sign of the times within our church in the United States. 60% of Catholics in the U.S. under the age of 18 are Hispanic. Latinos are the future, and the future is here. But that future can be lost. The rate of faith retention among Latino immigrants is declining. Nearly a quarter of Hispanic adults are now former Catholics, according to Pew, and there's some dispute on that number, but it's a very significant number regardless. For previous immigrant groups, such declines usually did not occur until the third or fourth generation. The entire church, including the philanthropic community, is challenged to close the gap between the need and resources when it comes to Hispanic ministry. In a survey that FADICA and the USCCB National Collections Office commissioned last year, Hispanic Catholics indicated that they were the most inspired of all Catholics to increase their giving due to Pope Francis's message. There is a wonderful opportunity for innovation to open educational and parish pathways to ensure the full participation of a growing Latino family of faith. We can start with Hispanic youth ministry, which is a ministry at the heart of the church's future and also many times to the margins of our contemporary society, with 1 in 5 Hispanic children living in at-risk families. Yet of the 4,500 parishes that have Hispanic ministry, only 40% have the resources for a specific youth ministry. Leadership formation is a second area of concern where more resources are greatly needed. Currently, ministerial needs outnumber the Latino clergy, lay ministers, and theologians available to meet those needs. We must create pathways to higher education, including seminary and religious education for lay leaders. Professor Hosman Espino of Boston College, who studies Hispanic ministry in the U.S., poses this question: has the church adjusted its structures to serve and evangelize the millions of Latinos who are bringing new life to thousands of parishes? To engage this question with respect to philanthropy, FADICA is collaborating with the Mexican American Catholic College, the Leadership Roundtable, and the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio on a national symposium focused on Hispanic leadership and philanthropy for a 21st century church. There are so many examples that demonstrate the church living out Gaudium and Spes, is called to respond to the signs of the times, exercise a preferential option for the poor, help all people achieve a full and free life, and build up the common good. And there are so many opportunities to be a philanthropist through our church, whether our giving is organized through a foundation, a special parish collection, in offering our time to our community, or through a campus justice or service effort. All of us can participate in the joy and hope of Catholic philanthropy. And in doing so, we experience and share the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of our time, thus bringing Gaudium and Spes to life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexia. And our third speaker, and again, it's very appropriate on this anniversary of the death of Oscar Romero, Bishop Ricardo Ramìrez will speak on Gaudium et Spes, Medellín, and Puebla, in the witness of the Archbishop of Oscar Romero. And again, we wanted to do this panel is about how do we actually live joy and hope in this church. And if there's someone who is joyful and hopeful, it's definitely Bishop Ricardo Ramìrez, who is ordained in 1966 in Houston. He actually is a Basilian. Basilians, for instance, run the St. Michael's up in the University of Toronto. He is, again, he was the auxiliary bishop of San Antonio in 1981 by Pope John Paul II, and named him auxiliary bishop then. And then he became the first bishop of the Diocese of Las Cruces, New Mexico, in October of 1982. And I'm going to turn things over to Bishop Ricardo.
I went to the bookstore yesterday. I couldn't find the book I was looking for, PowerPoint for Dummies. So the first thing is to turn it on, and I don't know how to turn it on. Is it showing?
Yep.
Okay, good. Among the most important, most relevant, and most influential documents of the Church of the 20th century were the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium and Spes, the Apostolic Exhortation of Paul VI, Evangelii Nuntiandi. That's probably the most quoted document of the 20th century of any pope. Pope Francis uses it a lot in his, and also Romero used it quite a bit. That's Evangelii Nuntiandi. And also the conclusions of Medellín, 1968. Medellín is a city in Colombia. And the conclusions of Puebla. Puebla, as you know, is in Mexico. These landmark documents have been especially important for the Church in Latin America and formed the theological and pastoral mind and heart of Archbishop Oscar Romero, soon to be blessed. The Archbishop took to heart the inspired words of the bishops gathered at the Second Vatican Council. By the way, those are these are banners that were at Aparecida in Brazil at the last conference. There's been 5 conferences. The first one was Rio de Janeiro there on the left, and then Medellín, then Puebla, and then Santo Domingo, and the one not showing is Aparecida. Actually, the church where these are at the Basilica at Aparecida, where the last conference took place. The teaching style of the Archbishop emulates Vatican II. It's invitatory, it's dialogical, hopeful, prophetic, founded on truth, Christ-centered, and non-condemnatory. It's interesting with Archbishop Romero that he showed us that it was possible to be prophetic without being condemnatory. The Archbishop took to heart the words of the bishops gathered at the Second Vatican Council, of Pope Paul VI, and the Latin American bishops at Medellín and Puebla. In practically all his homilies, pastoral letters, and pronouncements, he quotes these teachings. They inspired his witness in the world, in his life, and in his death. Today is the 35th anniversary of his assassination. Archbishop Romero was not a bishop during the council, so he did not attend. Neither was he at Medellín, but he was at Puebla, which was held in 1979, the year before his assassination. Gaudium et Spes became the most talked of conclusions of the council. It is known worldwide for its iconic opening, the joys and hopes, the griefs and anguishes of all the people of our time, especially of those who are poor or in any way afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ as well. We've heard that phrase over and over again these days. It was in the first period of the council, 1962, that the idea for the church in the modern world originated. The person credited with the idea was Cardinal Sunens, who spoke about 2 documents regarding the church. The first would be ad intra, that is, the church would look into its inner reality and ask the question, what do you have to say about yourself? The second would be ad extra, the relationship with the church to the world outside of it, and ask the questions of the human person about social justice, about evangelization of the poor, about world peace. Cardinal Sunens' speech on the floor concluded when he talked about the possibility of this document. These are his actual words. "Let us hope that this plan that I propose opens a way for a better hearing of the church and understanding of it by the world today, and that Christ be for the men and women of our times evermore the way, the truth, and the light." There followed a prolonged applause. Gaudium Spes. Never, this is one of the key phrases that must have been embedded in the heart of Oscar Romero. Never has the human race enjoyed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power. And yet a huge proportion of the world's citizens are still tormented by hunger and poverty, while countless numbers suffer from total illiteracy. That could be said today as well. This is the backdrop of Medellín in 1968. At the University of Rice in Houston, they used to have a course, a whole semester studying 1968. What happened then? These are among some of the things that happened just in that time frame. Fidel Castro became Prime Minister of Cuba in 1959. The coup d'etats in Brazil, 1964, Argentina, and other places. Some of these were accompanied by lots of bloodshed. Defeats of Frente de Acción Popular, FRAP, in Chile, 1964. The U.S. Marine invasion of Santo Domingo in 1965. The death of Camilo Torres, priest turned revolutionary, in 1966. The death of Che Guevara in Bolivia in 1967, symbolic of the guerrilla wars throughout Latin America. And then there were worldwide student movements in more than 69 countries in 1968, including France, Mexico, and Argentina. I was in Mexico City, beginning my work there in 1968 when the massacre of Tlatelolco took place. The government said a few dozen people were killed. The actual number was in the hundreds. That was right before the Olympics. Worldwide student movement, in the U.S., the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. So this is a backdrop of Medellín. These things were going on at the time. This was the name of the document, of the conclusions of Medellín. The Church in the present-day transformation of Latin America in the light of the Council. The method was see, judge, and act, which is the analysis of the virtue of prudence by St. Thomas Aquinas. It was used in the priest worker movement and in France, and also in the Synod of Santiago de Chile. This was used also at Medellín. The mission of the Church, it desires to serve the world, radiating over it a light and life which heals and elevates the dignity of the human person, which consolidates the unity of society and gives a more profound reason and meaning to all human activity. From Medellín came 16 documents, the first two of which were justice and then peace. Expressions such as signs of the times and institutionalized violence and structural sin took on clear applications after Medellín, so much so that in the violent reaction in some of the military dictatorships of the time, even the name of that Colombian city became synonymous with calls for liberation from unjust structures. The 70s, it also said, we cannot remain indifferent in the face of the tremendous social injustices which keep the majority of our peoples in dismal poverty and in many cases becomes inhuman wretchedness. Archbishop made his own the documents on justice and peace from Medellín. Signs of the times, institutional violence, structural sin. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, witnessed some of the most violent repression in modern history, including horrific attacks against the church itself. Those killed were poor women, men, children, bishops, priests, religious, catechists, and lay leaders. There were also American martyrs. By the way, these pictures were taken at a tent during the Aparecida conference in Brazil. It was not an official act, it was something done by individuals. And this was a tent down in the valley, and it was a tent in honor of the martyrs of Latin America. And among those pictures there were some Americans. So it was not only Archbishop Romero who was martyred, nor were the 6 Jesuits in 1989 the only priests killed. Literally scores of priests, religious, catechists, and lay leaders gave their lives during this bloody period, including some from our own country. Among the martyrs of the post-Medellín era was Bishop Enrique Angelelli of Argentina. His memory is dear to the heart of Pope Francis because he knew this man. They were good friends. Francis, when he was in Argentina as Bergoglio, he invited Angelelli to give a retreat to his Jesuit novices. He was slain in 1976. These were some of the most dramatic events of that time, and our Bishops' Conference was deeply involved in expressing its solidarity with the suffering churches of Latin America. I had the privilege of serving on U.S. C.S.B. committees dealing with these questions, participated in delegations to these churches, and represented our conference on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. These were exciting, frustrating, and sad times, but that's not what I want to focus on now. Puebla. Puebla was, in a way, difficult because people knew that Medellín was influenced greatly by liberation theology. So liberation theology became a point of contention during the conference in Puebla. The first speeches of Pope John Paul II were very much wary of liberation theology. It was disappointing to hear what he had to say. I was at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe when he spoke to the clergy, and it wasn't a very joyful nor hopeful message. But something happened to the Pope along the way as he looked at the people and he saw the poverty, especially of the indigenous people. Something happened to him. So his whole message changed on the way to Puebla. And this is what he said in Puebla. He looked nice in a Mexican hat. He said, the Pope chooses to be your voice. This is the transformation in his, it seems. The voice of those who cannot speak or who have been silenced. He wishes to be the conscience of consciences, an invitation to action, to make up for lost time, which has frequently been a time of prolonged sufferings and unsatisfied hopes. The Church defends the legitimate right to privacy. This is a very important phrase right here. It was quoted over and over again. The Church defends the legitimate right to private property, but it is no less clear in teaching that there is always a social mortgage on all private property. Back to Gaudium and Spes. The joys and hopes, the griefs and anguish, etc., especially of those who are poor. The pastoral constitution went on to note, never has the human race enjoyed such abundance of wealth, resources, and yet so much hunger and so much poverty. So Medellín was the application of Vatican II to Latin America. Puebla then reaffirmed, then this was 79. Medellín, as you saw, was 1968. They were supposed to have it 10 years after Medellín, but then there was we had 3 popes 1 year, so there was that confusion. So Puebla was postponed a year, so it was 1979. Bob Pelton was there, I was there, Father Elizondo was also there. This is sort of a short summary by Father Virgil Elizondo of Puebla. It reaffirms, in spite of the difficulties and the internal fights inside Puebla, especially over liberation theology, it really did affirm Medellín. This is a summary by Father Elizondo. Conversion and the transformation of the existing structures of society, that's what it calls for, same as Medellín. If not, wars and revolutions are sure to come, and they sure did come. The way to peace is through the construction of economic and social systems based on liberty, equality, justice, and fraternity. To have peace, we must work to overcome injustice in the mechanism of our unjust world. I strive, Romero said, that we may not just have on paper and study in theory all that the Second Vatican Council and the meetings of Medellín and Puebla have tried to further in us, but that we may live it and interpret it in this conflict-ridden reality, preaching the gospel as it should be preached for our people. I continue to be a voice that cries in the desert. I know that the Church is making the effort to fulfill its mission. Archbishop John Quinn of San Francisco, then president of the NCCB, was one of the 3 U.S. bishops invited to attend Puebla. In his report to our conference, he said the directions of Medellín were decisively reaffirmed and that Puebla served only to strengthen the conviction of Medellín that the dominant social characteristic of Latin America is a widespread oppression of the majority of peoples in these nations. The mechanism of oppression is located in social structures that benefit a very few at the expense of the majority. The Church in Latin America, said Archbishop Quinn, both at Medellín and Puebla, has made the decisive choice to find in and through the poor the first imperative of evangelization. And now the 4th item on my modest list, the very reason we are all here today, Oscar Arnulfo Romero Galdames, Archbishop and Martyr. What is there to say that hasn't been said or written, especially over the past year when it became known that not only had Pope Benedict unblocked the beatification process, but that Pope Francis, long a devotee of Romero, announced that his death was that of a martyr who died in odium fidei, for hatred of the faith, and that his beatification could proceed quickly. The blocking, it may be appropriate to note, was led largely by a couple of Latin American cardinals in the Curia, including the leader of the conservative side at Puebla. The day before his death, he preached once more his prophetic words that are here on the screen. Let me conclude with a few words from Julian Filochowski, founder of the Archbishop Romero Trust in Britain. By the way, this foundation, you can find it online, has the speeches and sermons of Archbishop Romero, and you can hear his voice. He was here last September for the International Conference on Romero. He keeps in touch with Archbishop Paglia, who recently wrote on the tablet on Romero as martyr and future icon. He writes, Romero was a passionate exponent of the Second Vatican Council and could quote from the whole corpus of Catholic social teaching and the Latin American church's commitments made at Medellín and Puebla. He saw the plight of the poor and put himself alongside them and applied the church teachings to the desperate plight of the grassroots Christian communities made up of landless peasants in the countryside and poverty-stricken urban dwellers in the capital city. He speculated that the canonization may come as early as August 2017, the centenary of Romero's birth, or even sooner, with widespread speculation that Pope Francis will dispense with further canonical requirements and go ahead with the canonization in Rome. Pope Francis clearly admires Romero, and reading his Evangelii document constantly brings forth Romero to mind. Julian's conclusion, and mine, is that St. Oscar Romero could well become an icon for this pontificate alongside Francis of Assisi, exemplifying a faith that does justice and that courageous love of the poor that St. Francis encourages and tries to emulate. Thank you.
So we want to open up for questions. Again, there's microphones on either side. There's microphones also upstairs. So yeah, just go up to the microphone. And so Matthew.
Thank you, Bill. Matthew Baggett from Spring Hill College. This is a question primarily for Dr. Appleby, but I'm sure that all three panelists could answer it as well. Dr. Appleby, you talked about the you made 5 points that the Catholic Church can contribute to the future of these issues. And I wanted to ask you about the dark side of religion, an aspect that you know only too well from your book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, which, let me thank you again for. It remains a template in my own teaching of religion and international politics. I'm always reminded when I think of that book of the image of Serbian troops that you cite in the book, wearing crucifixes as they raped Bosnian women. And the 5 points that you made, they struck me at least as being very positive. And I wondered if you could just say a word about some of the darker aspects, the manipulation of religion by nationalist forces, these sorts of things that the Church has to be aware of as we move forward. Thank you.
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah, you can answer that one first.
Okay. I'd be happy to wait and think about it if you want to take another question. It's a profound question and deserves a longer response than I'll give. And my thought immediately went to Pope Francis when you asked the question. In every religious tradition, not least Catholicism, there's a temptation to idolatry. And that idolatry is, I think, the worst enemy of religion because it makes the religion itself and the tradition the end rather than the divine. And one of, I think, the most powerful witnesses of Francis is his humility and a sense of joy within that humility. That I couldn't imagine him leading the church in a direction of reifying itself. This is in no way to deny the church's mission in the world and its establishment by Christ, but also his awareness of fallibility. And this part of this sounds maybe an odd image, but those of you who have watched the classic TV show, The Wizard of Oz, how many of you know what I'm talking about? And I know how old you all are now. But there's a scene there where the good witch and the evil witch are confronting one another, and the evil witch is inciting fear and threatening, and the sky is going to fall and so forth. And the good witch throws her head back and laughs and says, "Oh, be gone," whatever the witch's name is, "you have no power here." And I know this is a stretch, but there's a sense of Francis and of the church that also Bishop Ramìrez has just invoked for us, of a kind of quiet confidence that that this kind of idolatry has no power in the church. And I think that is our great hope, that because the violence, the extremism is rooted in a kind of a self-referential narcissism and a self-righteousness that is not in the spirit of Gaudium and Spes and not in the spirit of the current leadership of the Pope or of Oscar Romero and many of the people in this room. So that's the beginning of a conversation about this, but it's a very good question, so thank you.
My name is Aliba from the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Uganda. My Lord Bishop, you touched the word non-discriminatory. And Professor Scott, you talked of engagement. These have been words which have eaten me up for quite a long time. The transfer of the gospel to the head and its values has been a little bit easy, and I thank you, bishops and the missionaries in my country. But the transfer of the same values from the head to my heart, so that whenever you see me talk, wherever I am, you see Emmanuel Aliba, the one who is rooted in Christ, has been a challenge not only to me, but to my people in Uganda too. And then the most difficult has been the transfer of this gospel in the heart to my life at home. My Lord, I'm a married person with children. My life at home to be rooted in Christ. And also, I'm a senior person in Uganda. I'm employed by the Bishops' Conference and an executive at that. My word is heavy in Uganda. But also, the place many people I meet, usually in the evenings of my life. In the evening, I'm in a Rotary Club, I am in wedding meetings and so on. That transfer of the gospel to the Rotary Club, to the weddings, has been a challenge to me. And that has caused a number of things not going on well. I need your assistance, my Lord Bishop and Professor. Thank you very much.
Scatter.
Defer to the bishop.
How does he live the life throughout the after work and beyond the bishops?
How do you live
Gospel life
the gospel life
in your heart throughout the day.
in your heart throughout the day? Is that the question? Oh my God. You're asking the wrong person. I'm just a bishop. I think the main thing, I believe, is to be in constant conversation with the Lord all day long and living in His presence. Not that I do it, but, you know, the Lord speaks in the silence of one's heart. And in this world in which we live, there's lots of noise. And everybody is demanding attention, whether it's instruments of social media, such as telephones, cell phones, etc., whether it's commercials on the radio and television, whether it's children in the house. I love children, but I'm glad they're not mine, because they can be very noisy, and they can shriek. And also, when they laugh, they screech. Adults laugh, but they don't screech like children. We've lost the art of screeching. But so there's all this noise all around us. But I think the main thing is to enjoy silence when you can. I happen to live by myself, and I often turn off everything, and it's wonderful. Silence is wonderful. So I guess that's my answer, is silence.
One last question?
Thanks to all of you, and I was just struck with a question from Aliba. Father Ted Hesburgh used to say, the way you live your vocation is to love the people that come into your life. And I think of that with philanthropy. The word means loving other people. Okay, you step into an elevator. Pope Francis is in there. You've got 6 floors to say to him what you'd want to say to him about the church in the United States. What would it be?
Yeah, Alexia.
Please stay in good health.
The Pope, what he will say?
And what would you say to him? 6 words about the church.
What would I say to him about the church in the United States? Well, I would certainly talk to him about the situation of Hispanic peoples. And how much we have to do to prepare for the future. There's an interesting article in one of the recent issues of The Economist on the Hispanics in the United States. It's interesting. They were able to do a very clever cover of The Economist with the American flag with chilies. We are real hot stuff. Anyway, it says that we're making a mistake in not educating Hispanic peoples. It uses the example, the writer, the example of Texas. In Texas, they want to charge the out-of-state tuition for undocumented students in universities. Well, not too far from now in the future, Texas, the majority in Texas will be Hispanics. Already in the Houston Independent School District, over 50% of the children are Hispanic children. So the future of Texas is Hispanic. We have to educate them. We're putting in blocks. We shouldn't be putting blocks in their education. So there's one thing I would tell them is that we really need to work on them. We need to work on Hispanic vocations. And a recent article by Sister Marianne Walsh in America magazine talks about this issue, that we don't have the vocations that we need for our Hispanic peoples. And the way to do it is to engage the young Hispanics into our parishes, into activities and so on, and give them tasks to do within the church that we're ignoring a real potential.
Alexia, you get the last word.
I would thank him and say that we're praying for him every day. I would also thank him for what he's doing on modern slavery and human trafficking, and really he's done a wonderful job. This has been written about recently, working with a number of women survivors in partnership in Argentina and now continuing at the Vatican. Women survivors who are leading efforts of NGOs, and he's partnered with them while at the Vatican. And I would thank him for that, and just affirm that same model of partnership with women leaders as he moves forward with, and he has talked about working to encourage and strengthen women's leadership in the church, that model of partnership with women for increasing the roles and the opportunities for women in the church's leadership. We just affirm that model. And there's several women at the Vatican, ambassador to the Vatican from Chile, Maria Jimenez, and Sister Mary Maloney, who was president, the first woman president at one of the pontifical universities, to just encourage that kind of partnership and affirm what he's been doing with respect to women in the church.
All right, if we can thank our panel on Living Hope and Dr. Scott Appleby, Alexia Kelley, and Bishop Ramìrez.